Do we have to abide in the vine, Christ, in order for us to persevere and make it to heaven? Or can we stop abiding in him and yet be saved, like once saved, always saved? Find out in this episode.
God's Resistance.
Well, I'm happy to have you with us here at God's Resistance. Thank you for tuning in. We are going to be looking in John chapter 15 about the vine and abiding in Christ. And oftentimes there is just kind of this, well, it is in our day right now, the idea that we can be a Christian and still live however we want because we've been saved back there. And I've been going through a series about once saved, always saved, and more recently, the idea of salvation being conditional. And I know some people may be upset about that, but we want to see, what does Jesus say? And so without further ado, what we're going to do is look in John chapter 15 to find out. So John 15, we read, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser," or the husbandman. "Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. Already you are clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me, and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit, for apart from me you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers, and the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned." So that sounds pretty intense. So we're going to just be walking through this here, and I'd like to go back to verse number 1, where it says, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser." So Jesus is the vine that all of the branches must be connected to, in order for us to have spiritual life, in order for us to be a part of the church. So he says he is the true vine, and he says, my Father is the vine dresser. He is the husbandman. So he takes care of the church and the vine, and he has a certain end in mind, and that is that this vine be fruitful. And we'll see that in just a little bit. But if we move to verse 2, he says, "Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, and every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit." So now we're talking about, when we're talking about the branch, we're talking about a believer. And he's saying any believer, any branch in me that doesn't bear fruit. So everyone, that is every believer, is in need of abiding in Christ without exception, according to what Jesus is saying here in this verse. And he says, if. This is where the conditional aspect of salvation comes in. You may say, well, this is not conditional on salvation. This is just about fruitfulness in his work. Hang on, we're going to go through this whole thing and hope to see that that is in fact what Jesus is trying to bring across. So he says, if every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, and every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes it, that it may bring more fruit. Perhaps I was looking at a different translation where it was talking about if, but there is a condition here implied nonetheless, and that is, if we don't abide in the vine, something happens. If we abide in the vine, something happens. So here is the condition. And so if we don't bear fruit, according to this verse, then we are taken away. The next question is, if we're taken away, where are we taken away to? Does bear, but then we have the other part where it says, if you do bear fruit, then there's something else that happens. And that is the Father prunes. And you might say, well, why is the Father pruning? And this is what I was saying just a moment ago. God the Father is looking for a fruitful vine. He's looking for a fruitful church. He's looking for fruitful believers, fruitful branches. So he prunes so that it may bring forth more fruit. And I have done pruning before. I know my dad used to do fruit trees, apple trees. We had done pear trees, things like that nature. And I've done grape vine pruning as well. You're not necessarily just pruning away branches that there's something wrong with them, as if they're not a branch of the tree. They are a branch of the tree, and they're growing rapidly. I know in apple trees, you would get suckers, and throughout a summer season, you would get 3-4 foot long suckers that would go straight up. The problem is If you don't prune those off, then the growth goes to all of these branches, but doesn't actually put its power into the fruit. So I remember going to some trees that were neglected, and we would have to go in and climb up in the center. We'd have to lop off those suckers that were even coming up from the center in the trunk. Then we'd climb up in the tree and we'd lop them off all around, and we would shape the tree towards fruiting spurs. And we tried to do a balance between making it look nice and you getting fruit. But we would have to cut those suckers off and pay attention to where fruiting spurs were, because you were trying to concentrate the growth to go into the fruiting spurs. So we're told that the Father, he prunes because he's looking for much fruit to be born. Now, obviously, if there is diseased branches, you would cut those off, but that's not the objective of pruning. The objective of pruning is training all the growth to go towards the fruit, right? And to not have it be something that is unwieldy. And so it is safe to say that the Father is looking for fruit in every single believer. And there's no such thing as super Christians that are spiritual, and then there's the other class of Christians that just aren't spiritual. Everybody is supposed to be somebody who is bearing fruit. Everybody is supposed to be spiritual and growing in the presence and power of Christ, becoming more and more in every single one of our lives, if we call ourselves Christians, if we call ourselves believers. But if we move on to verse 3, he said, already you are clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. And I think that this easily is talking about, this is the moment of entrance into salvation. They've already been clean. They're already in the church. They're already in the vine. They've already entered in. He has cleansed them. These disciples were already clean. The word of Christ led them into a saving relationship with God. And that's where we find ourselves here. But as we move on to verse 4, he says, abide in me and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. Okay, so now we have this word abide. And what does this mean? Abide is like dwelling. It's a place we live. It's not something transient where we come in for a little while and then we leave for a little while. Even though some people's Christian experience may be that way, the Bible doesn't bear out that this is normal and this is how things should be. Jesus said we are to abide in him. He said if we abide in him, if we dwell in him, if we continually live in him, then he said it's reciprocal. Then he will then live within us, which is amazing. And that's a wonderful thing. That's what the Christian wants. I want to be close to God. I want to dwell in him and he dwell in me. I want it to be a walk with God, like we read about with Enoch or even Adam before the fall. He walked with God in the cool of the day. And so he's saying, Jesus is saying, if you abide in me, I will abide in you. And then he goes back to the agricultural idea of pruning and fruit and all that kind of stuff. He says, as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself, unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. It's just a given, okay? We realize that if a stick is cut off from a tree, we don't expect a stick on the ground disconnected from a tree to be starting to bear fruit there. We would look down and be like, well, that one's not a part of this tree anymore. But we rightly expect that fruit should be coming from those twigs or branches or whatever you might call it that are still attached to the tree. We still expect that fruit should come from that. And he is saying, you guys understand this. You live in agricultural society. You know nobody's expecting fruit to come from something that's been severed from the main branch of something, especially in this case, grapevine. And so he's saying, that just like a fruit cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, he says, neither can you unless you abide in me. Now, so he's saying that we're to abide in Christ. And the next question I would have is, how do we do that? Maybe you would have that question. And what we would do is by sinning. I would ask this question. Do we abide in him by sinning? And then Jesus' blood just covers all our future sins, like once saved, always saved? No, that doesn't make any sense. How we abide in the vine, how we abide in Christ is by loving obedience to him. See, biblical faith is not just a mental assent. It is, the devils believe and they're headed to hell, right? So it's not just a mental assent. Biblical faith is faith and works are wedded together, as James says. He says that we're not saved. Well, we know we're not saved by our works alone, but he shows that true biblical faith is evidenced by works that show a living faith. We are to continue in that living faith. Remember, James said something like, show me your faith by your works. He said, I'll show you my faith by my works. And he said, faith without works is dead. In other words, if we just have a mental assent, we believe the special doctrinal framework of what it means to be saved, so we don't have to worry about the sin that's in our lives, we're totally missing the point. James said faith without works is dead. In other words, if your faith doesn't work, you may not have that faith to begin with, or you may have walked away from it and you may be in danger. These are things that we need to understand. So we need to abide in Christ. The how is through loving obedience. It is a faith that works, but why? Well, he tells us so very plainly, a branch cannot bear fruit by itself. That's why. A branch only stays alive as long as it's connected to the plant. And it's the same with us. Death can take place in us spiritually if we choose not to abide in Christ. This is the warning. But you may say, no, that's not what's really going on here. The real issue is abiding in him and whether we're going to be fruitful in his labors. We'll still get into heaven. We'll still be able to go there because that is once saved, always saved. It's eternal salvation from the moment we believe, and there's nothing that can sever that. However, this parable, I say parable, it's I guess it'd be more of a metaphor, bears out something entirely different. And as we go along, I hope you would see that it's not just about works that he's talking about here, just about our fruitfulness in his kingdom, but it's much more than that. In verse 5, he said, I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. So he reiterates the same thing again. Jesus is the vine. Jesus is the source. Jesus is the lifesaver. We are the branches growing out of him. And so we bear the fruit the Father is looking for only as we continually abide in him. And again, you would say at this point, this is what I'm talking about, though, brother. You're saying this, and it is so obviously speaking about fruit. This is a fruit issue, not a salvation issue. But I would bring you back to the beginning. If God the Father, if he's looking for fruit out of every single believer, not just some, but every single believer, if he is looking for fruit and he says the way that this should happen is by you abiding in the vine, this is the Father's intention for every single believer that they should bear fruit. What happens if we are not bearing fruit? Where we're already been told here that if we are not bearing fruit, then we are one of those branches that's just cut off, right? But if we are bearing fruit, he prunes us so that we might bear more fruit, right? We don't want to be a branch cut off. Verse 6, this really brings this out in a much more poignant manner. He says, if anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers, and the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. Okay, this is why I would say this has to do with not only just is he talking about the fruit that we would bear in the work of his kingdom and all those kind of things, but it has bearing on our eternal salvation, especially according to this verse. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers, and the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. That's a terrible expression. Adam Clark sums it this way. 1, we can be cut off from Jesus, having no longer any right or title to him or to his salvation. 2, he is withered when we're cut off. So we're deprived of all the influences of God's grace and spirit. We lose all of the heavenly unction that we may have through the Spirit. We become indifferent, cold, and dead to every holy and spiritual word and work. Number 3, then we are gathered. So we become, through the judgment of God, again united with backsliders, like the one that's cut off, and other workers of iniquity, and being abandoned to our own heart and Satan, then we are, number 4, cast into the fire, separated from God's people, from God himself, and from the glory of his power. And 5, finally, we are burned. We are eternally tormented with the devil and his angels, and with all those who have lived and died in their iniquity. And then Adam Clark says this, reader, pray God that this may never be thy portion. So, are you abiding in Jesus Christ? Do you see how our fruit bearing now plays a part in our eternal salvation? Are you still trying to divorce your works from your salvation? Or will you agree with James and here with Jesus that we must abide in him in order to be fruitful and to be saved? Thank you for tuning into this. If you have enjoyed this, then I would ask you to like, comment, and subscribe so that you can get further updates on these videos. Visit godsresistance.com, and I will see you in the next video.